started to climb right up to the top where I thought I'd find a hunk of rock with a big spot just right out there about burning pit. On the second day, I made the top, and I'm telling you, Steve, I was ready to stop. The only clicking that I heard that day was the bones in the back. Going straight. Uranium fever has come and got me down. Uranium fever, it's spreading all around. With a guy and uranium fever has gone and got me down. Uranium fever is spreading all around. With a Geiger counter in my hand,
I'm a-going out to stake me some government land.
Uranium fever has gone and got me down.
This particular CJ5 is from the year of 1978, and it has all of the additions basically possible for that year. It has the Levi edition Spice Denim seats. I don't know why they didn't just call them tan, but they are Spice Denim. It has the Dixie edition chrome wheels. Again, I don't know why they didn't just call it the chrome wheel edition, but again, Dixie. And it was, at one point, the Golden Eagle edition, which is, if you don't know, is just the top boss of 1977, I think was the year it started, until 1978, because in 1979 it went to something different. I can't remember exactly what. Beyond the additions, what this car is equipped with is it has a 304 cubic inch V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor, if you care about that. It has a 3-speed transmission, manual, again, if you care about that. And it is set in 411 gears, so it is pretty fun to drive just because it has some good acceleration. The safety features on this vehicle are at a minimum because what you get is basically a handlebar here on the dash and your lap safety belts. Other than that, you get hopes and prayers. If this car rolls over, it does have a roll bar, but most people are taller than the roll bar. And if you're in the back, you might as well say goodbye because you are the roll bar back there. Anyway, the history of the Jeep is very full, very long, and very interesting if you're into history. So if you're specifically here for the history, well, I appreciate you being here. There are better videos on the history, but I'll give my best approximation of all the information I've absorbed into my brain. So the history of this fine automobile began in the late 30s, back before World War II. America had just come out of the Great Depression with good old FDR, and the military was expecting, hey, we're probably going to go to war soon because all the Europeans are upset. So yeah, we should probably get ready for that. And one of the main things that they thought of in preparation was A, get a new set of weaponry, which generated a whole shebang of history that you could find out about. And it also went to, hey, we should probably find a way to replace horses and motorcycles because while they were useful, they weren't very good off-road, at least in the motorcycle sake, and they couldn't get scared, as in the horse's sake, because if a bomb goes off, not near enough to hurt it, but near enough to scare the horse and it runs off with the person on it, it's not very useful anymore. So what they decided is like, all right, let's get a vehicle with 4-wheel drive, because that way it'll be good off-road in the trenches and mud and all this crap. Pardon my French. So they went to all the automakers. They went to GM, they went to Ford, they went to Willys, they went to Bantam, they went everywhere. Except foreign corporations, because they were like, I don't know, they didn't want foreign cars. Anyway, so the important one is Willys there. And a lot of history videos will say that Bantam were the ones who designed the Jeep, they got the contract, they made them through the war. They did not. Willys actually entered into a competition, which is how military stuff gets figured out. Is there's a competition to see if the thing is good, and they pick whoever wins the competition. And Bantam actually won the competition at first, so I guess they're technically right. But the US government, after about 5 minutes of testing it, decided that, hey, a throttle on the dash isn't the best option, but we do like the engine, even though the transmission and throttle are all wrong. So they went back to Willys like, hey, if you can put a better engine in it, we'll buy it from you instead of Bantam. And Bantam was like, hey, what the heck? And Willys like, all right, bet. So they just stole the engine out of the Bantams, called the Go Devil, and put it in the Jeeps. And the U.S. government was like, all right, we'll go with that. Bantam then went on to, I guess, just go out of business because their one, at least pseudo-decent product didn't work out in their favor. And Willys was like, all right, cool, we'll make them for you. How many do you need? And the government was like, all of them. We need like 600,000 to the end of the war. That wasn't the original number they gave. That's just how many ended up being made. And Willys back then was like, all right, we'll do our best. We won't be able to make all those 600,000. We can make probably around 250,000. And the government was like, all right, cool. Do you give us permission to let other people make them? And they're like, yeah, sure, as long as we get some of the blowback from it. So they're like, all right, cool. Ford, you're up. And Ford was like, woo! Yippee! Quick side note. For the Jeeps that Ford made, if you look on almost every part of them, there's a tiny little F symbol, and that was the only difference between the Willys Jeeps and the Ford Jeeps. I just thought that was interesting and cool. If you ever find one of these old Ford or Willys Jeeps, just look at literally any part, and you should be able to find a tiny little Ford font F. Anyway, back to the history. And Willys like, okay, all right, cool. So then that's what the war was, is they went through, they made all the Jeeps, they made, like I said, they made around 600,000 Jeeps in total. And this was the MP, this was, I don't remember what MP stands for, it's just Jeep. The military MP Jeep. So now that the war is coming to an end, Willys is like, hey, we're not going to be able to sell as much of the Jeep because the government is going to be able to buy very many of them just because they're not buying as much. So all the people at Willys were like, hey, what should we do? And one dude, I don't know who this dude was, I don't think anybody knows who this dude was, he had the stroke of genius that was, hey, why don't we convert the Jeep for civilian use? And everybody else at the company was like, okay. So what they did is, toward the end of the war, they started developing and they marketed the civilian edition of the Jeep. And on a quick side note, when coming up with the name CJ, they were like, hey, what should we call it? People know it as a Jeep, but we can't just call it the Jeep because we have the military Jeep. And if it's just the Jeep, people think, oh, military car. So again, I think it was a different dude with a stroke of genius. It's like, hey, hear me out. Civilian Jeep, CJ. And they're like, oh my God. And if you look, the original CJs were the CJ2A. That is because before the war, they considered, since they had spent most of the company's life building the regular Jeep for the military, they considered the first version of the Willys Overlander to be the CJ1, which is fair, I guess. They're honoring their history, even though it had been like 7 years. But anyway, they went with the CJ2A, because the original CJ2 was just a test vehicle. So CJ2A was the refined version. And I'm not kidding, the only difference between the Jeep and the civilian Jeep was bigger headlights and a tailgate. That's what I call innovation. And you'd imagine that since Jeeps are still being made to this day in the great year of 2024, just to mark the video, the CJ2A must have been a great success. They must have sold thousands and made so much money. They didn't. It sold about as well as a soggy pair of socks. It was, it was pretty terrible. And the main reason why is because for the few people who did buy one, their main complaint was, hey, it's uncomfortable because it just has a new tailgate and bigger headlights. I can't stress how funny that is, that was the only changes, and they put like, I think it was like $1 million worth of development. It was hilarious. Anyway, so they're like, ah, crap, what do we do? What do we do? We aren't making money. I know, let's make the CJ3A. Just 3 makes sense after 2. And so what they decided to do was they decided to add nicer cloth or leather seats, a cloth removable top, just so you can make it a convertible, and they decided to add a little bit more legroom, which basically means they took a hammer to the firewall. He's doing his thing. Anyway, so after the CJ3A, that one must have sold right, since they're still being made. No, those ones sold about the same, just because, hey, they're not nice enough. The radio isn't high quality enough, the seats aren't high quality enough, dogs can't get out of them enough. You know, this isn't a CJ3A. So they're like, ah, crap, we're out of money. What do we do now? And this fella came by, he's like, hey, I'll buy you one. And this was late 52. The good old year of 1952, year of our Lord. Anyway, and by 1953, or in 1953, the Willys Overland Company had been sold to this wonderful man named Kaiser. And Kaiser, he's a character. He originally started his career in the medical field. And he founded a small company. It didn't really go very far. It was called Kaiser Permanente. And as we know today, it's still up and well, despite some recent troubles. So he was like, all right, one last run of the CJ3A, see if we can sell it just a little bit more. So that was the CJ3B, in which he took out that little Go Devil engine, since it had gotten heavier, and he put in basically his own design from his previous cars, because he had made a few at that point, a more powerful engine. And if you ever look at an old CJ3A and it has a really like tall and square front hood, that is because they needed to extend the height of the hood so they could fit this more powerful engine in. And you may be asking, well, how much power did this more powerful engine make if it made such a difference? 64 horsepower. I'm pretty sure my lawnmower makes more horsepower than that, but anyway. So then after that, they ran that for a couple years. That one actually sold very well because, again, Kaiser improved the radio that was in there, and with more power, the car could get up to speed better on it. The interstates weren't a thing at the time, but it could just get up to speed on the roads better. And then after that, they started development of what would be known for a very long time as the CJ5. And the CJ5 was a complete redesign. It shared almost zero parts with the CJ3, the CJ2, or even the original military MP Jeep. And that is because Kaiser was like, all right, so there's not a whole lot of room to work with. So what if we, hear me out, made it a little bigger? And everybody who had come over from Willys and gone to Kaiser was like, you'll have to redesign the whole frame. And Kaiser was like, yeah, get to it. And so they did. And what came out was a CJ5, which could seat 4. It had 2 front seats and like a back seat and a half. It's a small bench. You can barely fit 2 grown men in it. If you do have 2 full-grown men in it, you can't buckle. And originally they also didn't come with seat belts, just because that wasn't really a requirement at the time. That changed after just a couple years, but it's still funny. Anyway, and this new one, they decided, hey, we want more engine. So they put in a 6-cylinder instead of the usual 4-cylinder, which helped a lot. And then they decided, hey, even better, let's put a 4-speed in it so it can actually go over, I don't know, 50 miles an hour. So they did. And what ended up happening was the CJ5 was the best-selling Jeep ever for them at that point. Which makes sense, because they made it for like 30 years. One more quick side note. So, in 1970, I believe, Kaiser ran out of money. Again, Jeep kind of does that to people. So, Kaiser went to AMC, the American Motor Corporation. It's like, hey, I'll sell you a Jeep if you give me money. Which AMC was like, we get a military contract and we get the Jeep IP. So they gave them, I can't remember how much, it was around, I want to say $5 million for the whole thing. And starting in 1970, they began with 3 new engine options. There was still a 4-cylinder, which nobody really cares about. There were 2 6-cylinders, and there was a 8-cylinder, which was a 304 cubic inch V8 with a 2-barrel carb, like I said earlier, which is in this guy. So yeah, and later in like 76 and beyond, they did occasionally make a 400 cubic inch version, which I can't imagine how fun that thing is to drive, but yeah, I just thought I'd let you know. Okay. So, in the 70s, now that AMC is the owner of the Jeep Motor Company, they decided, hey, alright, let's make a new Jeep, just so we can expand our market even more. So they made what was called the CJ7, which was, at least mechanically, the exact same as the CJ5, but it was slightly longer. It again had that tailgate, and the door frames were square. And the rear seat was slightly bigger, so you could actually fit 2 grown men in it. And beyond that, they're like, hey, since the way we built the CJ7 was we just made it longer, what if we made it even longer, took out the back seats, put the rear window right behind the front seats, and gave it a truck bed? And that turned out to be the CJ8 Scrambler, which is, and I might make some people mad, is my favorite truck to ever be built. Anyway, so once I finished with that, both the Scrambler and the CJ7 and the CJ5 all ended their production at the same time when Renault bought a portion of the company, and the US government was like, hey, no, we don't want French people making military equipment. Because if you know about France and military history, it's not good. And the US government gave AMC an ultimatum. They could do one of 3 things. They could either sell the shares that Renault had bought back to Renault and become a completely American company again, which AMC couldn't afford to do because they just didn't have a lot of money. Like I said, it's a curse with Jeeps. Whoever owns it just does terribly financially until the next people who own it. They could sell off Jeep to another American company, and they could keep making the Jeeps, and they could keep making military Jeeps. And the third option was the military could just cut the Jeep entirely, and AMC could keep Jeep. And AMC was like, well, the Jeep has worked, so we don't want it to get cut. So how about we sell it to Chrysler? And the US government was like, good, yeah. Classic American vehicle, won the war, won World War II. We're still gonna stop using it. And AMC was like, I just sold it to Chrysler. Why'd you do that? And the U.S. military was like, well, we have the Hummer now, which is basically better in every way, except for gas mileage. But we won't talk about that right now. And AMC was like, what the heck, dude? And the government was like, hey, not my problem anymore. I got the Humvee. And Chrysler was like, cool, I'll make Jeeps now. First order of business, cut the entire line. We're making this new type of Jeep. In which that was the YJ. If we're going by the naming conventions of Jeeps, it was the Yavilian Jeep instead of the civilian Jeep. It didn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, and they decided to call it, instead of just the CJ, they called it the Wrangler, since they didn't need the moniker of civilian anymore, because they were all civilian. So they called it the Wrangler, which is where the modern day Jeep Wrangler comes in. So it went from just being the Jeep, or the Jeep CJ5, to the Jeep Wrangler. Anyway, so after a minute, Chrysler, they're doing all right. They're building these cars for a while. They make another generation of the Jeep, which are the JK Jeeps, which are probably, after this one, my favorite generation of Jeeps. Anyway, and in 2004 up until around 2007, when again, the owners of Jeep are doing terribly financially. And so before then, before 2007, this kind of all leads into each other. In like 2004, 2003, Mercedes bought a portion of Chrysler and they became Daimler Chrysler, which is, they created things like, well, the Chrysler Crossfire, the Chrysler Aspen, and they actually helped create the Chrysler 300. Only one of those lasted. Anyway, so then Daimler then very quickly sold all their stocks back to Chrysler, and Chrysler was on its own, and then it went downhill, and then Fiat, Cameron's like, hey, you're struggling? I'm not struggling, I'm doing great. What if I bought 20% of your stocks and helped you out a little bit? Chrysler's like, great, perfect. Anything else? And Fiat was like, yeah, in like 5 months, I'm gonna buy the rest of you. And Chrysler was like, okay, sounds good. So in 2008, it became Fiat Chrysler, which eventually changed its name to Stellantis. That's a very dumb name, if you don't mind me saying, but anyway, Fiat Chrysler, in which they kept making Jeeps all the way till today. Yay, we finished a very rough outline of the history. Now for all the engine stuff involving Jeeps. Like I said, the original engine that came in that MB Jeep was called the Go Devil. And it was a 4-cylinder, and I can't quite remember how much horsepower it made, but I know it was around 50 horsepower somewhere, and it made, I believe it was 105 foot-pounds of torque. I know, a real monster. After that, it was the Kaiser's little 4-cylinder engine. That made 64 horsepower, and I believe it made around 150 pounds of torque. Like I said, lawnmowers are better. Anyway, and then once Kaiser had taken over, they put in 2 6-cylinder engines. The smaller one, I believe, made about, I want to say it was 140 horsepower, around 140 horsepower, and the other one was about 180 horsepower. And that's what lived in this, that's what lived in the Jeep up until AMC bought it, where again, they had, I believe it was 130 horsepower 6-cylinder, a 150 horsepower 6-cylinder, and this was a 220 horsepower V8. It was really cooking with gas now. And that 400 cubic inch that I mentioned earlier, I believe that one made around 280 horsepower, if I'm remembering correctly. And then once Chrysler bought it, they put a, I believe it was a 4.2 liter V6 into the car. It was really heavy, and it made barely any power. I believe it made 180 horsepower once again, and it weighed like 800 pounds. It was a whole lot of motor for not a whole lot of output. So they very quickly replaced that with the 3.6 liter V6, which made about 240 horsepower. And then that's what lived in the Jeep up until, along with the 2 liter 4-cylinder, which I believe made, again, 180 horsepower. Which made sense because that 4-cylinder was lighter, so it kind of evened itself out. And then up until I believe it was 2020 or 2018, somewhere around that portion, Stellantis at that point decided, hey, what if we put the 392 V8, the 392 cubic inch V8, from the Dodge Challenger into the Jeep? Which they did, and it did pretty well. It wasn't quite as impactful as they thought. And this was back when they were trying to spruce up the Jeep because the newer generation of the Ford Bronco had just come out. So like, hey, we need something to draw interest back to the Jeeps. And then after a few years, they took that out again just because Stellantis just kind of got rid of all of their V8s, including Dodge, which I don't know why Dodge, the king of muscle cars in the modern age, would get rid of their V8s.
By the power vested in this 454 Cazoo, I sentence you to non-existence.
But now they're making electric cars, which again, makes no sense. And now I believe they have a hybrid version of the Jeep. I believe it's the 4-cylinder engine, and I believe the front wheels are the hybrid-driven ones. And along with that, they also have that 3.6-liter V6 that still lives in there. Other than that, that's about it for the engines. Other than that, it's just a bunch of random outliers. Like, there are like 500 cars way back in the day made with a V6 engine. Like I said, not very many. And there's just little changes like that. This one in particular is, like I said earlier, the 304 cubic inch V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor. Yeah, and this was actually one of the first years of the Jeep to have power steering, which is what this fantastic little pump is. And yeah. This engine is also completely cast iron. All the the head, the block, the pan, the crankshaft, everything is cast iron on this engine. It weighs approximately, if I remember right, it was like, I want to say it was 700 pounds for the engine, and it makes that 220 horsepower. And the main complaint I have about this engine, at least in driving this Jeep, is that the engine itself heats up very, very quickly because it has a very tiny little radiator and a whole lot of engine that it has to try and cool. For the interior of these Jeeps, even though the CJ5, like I said, was much nicer than the CJ2 and CJ3, it was still very basic. So right here, like I said earlier, that is that safety handle. That's about it in terms of safety features. We have these canvas seats. Those are not the originals. Like I said earlier, they were originally these low back Spice Levi Denims seats. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this is the 3-speed transmission. So what looks like second right now is actually first gear. And if you look, that big dial in the middle there is the speedometer. And I don't know if you're able to see, but there's 2 little dials around the steering column. That is the tachometer for your RPM and the clock, because apparently AMC back in the day thought it was more important to see your clock than it was to see how fast you were going. Yeah, like I said earlier, if you mentioned efficiency when talking about this car, it wouldn't end well for you. You can see it has a big long shift lever. This is a manual transmission with those 3 pedals. And yeah. Another question you might have if you never have done it before, what are these things like to drive? Well, this one in particular, it's just a whole lot of fun. The steering is very floaty. It feels a lot like you're driving something much larger than you are. The brakes are spongy at best, just because it has rear drum brakes. It does have front disc brakes. This is, again, one of the earlier years that they did that. But again, they're like any old car, they're just pretty spongy. The acceleration is there, again, because that big V8. This car probably makes some of the best noises I've ever heard out of a V8 car, at least stock. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I wish I could show you a little bit better than just sitting here in this garage, but yeah. All right, so that's about all I really have to say about the Jeep. It just has a very interesting and full history. Has a long history, with it being, I believe, the second longest running production car ever, just behind the Chevy Suburban. One of my favorite cars ever. And I know saying that in a world full of Mustangs and Camaros and GT40s, that's a tall statement, but it is really one of my favorite cars ever. Hopefully you learned something in this video. If you didn't, I'd like to apologize, but hopefully you enjoyed the video anyways. Thanks for stopping by. And next time you see me, I know I usually do car videos. The only other video on my channel is, I believe, a go-kart video and a Mustang video. Say next time, if you don't come back, could be your doom. Anyway, thanks for stopping by. Have a good one. See you. This is for the end of the video. My dog. He looks dead. What are you doing, buddy? All right.